Okay. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for dialing in. I know it's been a while since we've all met. For those of you that were joined us from Tableau conference for our K-12 meetup, lots of familiar names on this one as well. But we had announced at the user group at Tableau conference that we were trying to set up ongoing user groups for K-12 nationally. So this is our first one, and we're really excited for all of you to be here. So Thomas, do you want to click over to the agenda? All right, so just a quick rundown of the agenda. We're going to start with a couple of introductions and just why we're here. And then we're going to pass it over, and Boulder Valley School District is going to give a presentation around using COVID's data for tracking, and then KIPP NorCal, that's Northern California, they're going to talk about using data for distance learning. And then at the end, Stephanie and Thomas will talk about resources for all of you and next steps regarding kind of future meetings and call to actions as well. So if we start with just introduction, so I'm Cassidy Macias. I work at Tableau. And I manage our education business over here at Tableau. I've actually been here for about 4.5 years. Was a former teacher myself out of college, and just have a really strong connection to K-12 for those reasons. So very excited to be here today supporting all of you. Stephanie?
Welcome everyone. I'm Stephanie Henry. I'm a manager with Plant Moran in the management consulting practice. So we support our clients with a variety of data analytics needs, including the processes that align with Tableau's blueprint. My background is in education. I was with a large school district in Colorado for just shy of 16 years prior to joining Plant Moran 3 years ago. I'm super passionate about data analytics, Tableau, education, and student success, and bringing like-minded people like yourselves together for rich conversations. I'm excited and honored to be a part of this user group, and I'm going to turn it over to Thomas.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. Thomas Price. I'm a consultant with Slalom in the data and analytics practice. Slalom, we're a consulting firm. We work in a variety of industries, but we've done quite some work in the education sector, including for clients such as Atlanta Public Schools. Prior to consulting, worked in the education sector for about 6 years at both the state and local level. Really excited to bring this community together. I think that there are always so many great relationships that can be formed, some great ideas that can be created just by bringing so many brilliant minds together, especially during COVID times like this, that everyone's either in school, out of school, but still trying to figure out how to create ways for our students to be successful as we transition back to hopefully a more in-school environment going forward. So.
Awesome. Thank you guys. And just want to give props to Stephanie and Thomas. They are two of our really amazing partners in the K-12 space and beyond. Both Plant Moran and Slalom do work in many verticals, at Tableau, but very strong partners of ours. Obviously, they both have a very strong K-12 background as well. And I don't want to steal their thunder, but they will be managing this user group going forward. So very excited and thankful for their help on this. Okay, so the last thing was, before I kind of hand it off, was why we're here. Those of you that haven't joined a user group before, a user group is really the time for you all to get together, and it's a forum for you to share your experiences, your best practices, kind of what you're struggling with, and really find ways to connect with others in this space. So we love, generally user groups are user-led. We're kicking this one off and sponsoring it and hoping it will run continually. But we really want you guys to build this network, this community that's been growing strong the last couple years. So we'll be sharing education best practices throughout each user group, and hopefully some resources that you can use and leverage. Virtually is a little difficult. In person, if you've been to a user group, it's obviously a lot easier to network and meet others and swap business cards or whatever. But we will have a forum at the end for you to potentially, swap contact information with attendees and not just panelists. The last thing that I do want to mention is we're going to be utilizing the Q&A feature on the Zoom today. So if you hover over your screen and there at the bottom, should be a Q&A box. If you have any questions for our presenters throughout, if you will put your questions there rather than the chat box, Stephanie will be managing that, and it'll just kind of be a little bit easier for her to manage. We'll repeat that as we go on, but again, really excited to kick this off and looking forward to 2021.
Awesome. So I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker for today, Clare Sims. So Clare, she is a senior data visualization designer with Boulder Valley School District. She's worked there for about 6 years. Her first role was as a data analyst, and now in her current role is the senior visualization designer. So using her passion for data analysis and design, Clare, she works with data owners, end users, and the district's data warehouse designer to create functional and beautiful data visualizations for educators. Once again, remind everyone, we're going to hold questions. We're going to answer questions at the end. Be sure and use that Q&A box. And with that, Clare, I transition it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me get my screen shared here. Okay, awesome. Great, well, thanks for that nice introduction. And it's great to see so many of you here virtually, and some of my Colorado friends on the list too. Always wonderful to see you. So thanks for coming today. So what I'm going to be talking about today is this project that I started working on last summer about tracking COVID screening data using Tableau. So hearing that the topic was, kind of responses to our current COVID times, I was like, I have the perfect project. This has evolved over time. We put a lot of work into it and really making sure that we do have a good health response to the COVID situation using data. So what I'll be sharing today is kind of the process of what that project has been, how I worked on it over time, and sharing some examples of those dashboards that our staff members are using now. All right. So, so back last July, I received this request, and kind of the gist of it is this: we need a visualization of COVID screening data that gets emailed daily to district leadership. So as I mentioned before, this is a project that, this is really the quick question that it started with, but it has evolved over time. And as I understood more what was involved in this project, I got a better idea of really, what are we talking about here? What's the scope? Who needs to see this data? So this has also been a collaboration across several different departments in the district. So a couple key departments I worked with: IT, of course, I worked with our health services department, but also HR, communications, operations. I think, as most of you know, the COVID response has really been a huge team effort across our district, and this project was no exception to that. So I received this request, and so really my first questions leading off of this were, one, what kind of data are we gathering? What do we mean by this screening data? And what specifically does leadership need to know about that data? So that really led me to learn a lot more about the context and what we were planning to do as we prepared to start this very unusual school year. So as we were planning to go back into the school year in the fall, we knew that students would be remote to start the year, but we were preparing for at least some staff to start coming back into our buildings. And so with that, our health services department needed to start doing passive screenings of everybody coming into our buildings. So staff, but eventually students, and also any visitors to the buildings. So this is an example of some of the signage that you will see on every BVSD building these days. But we remind everyone who's coming in that they need to complete this passive screening. There's a different form depending on your role, and you can scan in and do that. And again, the intention is to do that before even coming in. So a staff member comes in, they scan that QR code, and it's going to take them to this BVSD staff COVID screening Google form. So I'm just showing a quick snapshot here, but basically this form has 6 questions, and it's probably the same 6 questions that all of you are now very familiar with in COVID times. So questions about different potential COVID symptoms like fever, shortness of breath. Have you been in contact with a confirmed COVID case? So we collect that from everybody before they come in. And then here I kind of wanted to map out, so what happens with that information? Kind of what's the flow of that data, who's looking at it and using it? So the typical case we see here is that we have groups of employees who are reporting to a building or a department, and they're filling out that Google form. And what actually happens next is that really the first person who's looking at that data is a staff member in this role called a COVID coordinator. So that's a representative from each school or department who is responsible for monitoring that screening data for their employees. So they're kind of the first line of needing to see this data very often throughout the day and keep an eye on that. And then again, going back to that original request, that data does need to get to our district leadership so that they can keep an eye on that as well. Now there's a couple other situations that we need to be especially aware of with the data. So one of those is, let's say that we have a staff member who comes to the building but has not done their form. So again, that's something that the COVID coordinator needs to be on top of and make sure that they follow up and get that screening data from that employee. And then of course, a really important situation is if we do have an employee who has a positive screening. So if they answer yes to any of those screening questions, again, that's information that the coordinator needs to know very quickly so that they can start to follow up and figure out what's happening with that situation. And again, all of these cases need to roll up and get to the district leadership level so that that our superintendent, our health services department can really see quickly what's the situation across all of our buildings. All right, so having done that kind of picture of, what's the full context, what data are we talking about? I had some better answers to those original questions that I had. So in terms of who the audiences would be for this visualization, I knew that it was both district leadership, but also these COVID coordinators who were really needing some good timely data reports. What they needed to be able to do with the data. So a big one obviously was monitoring for potential outbreaks. And I just want to note here that when we look at the screening data, it's really more of a leading indicator. So that alone is not going to tell us if we even have an outbreak, if we even have a confirmed COVID case. Like, we need testing for that, we need more information. But the screening is an important first step that leads to more investigation of those cases, follow-up interviews, contact tracing, communication. So it's really an important first step of gathering data that feeds into all those other processes. And then really kind of daily on the ground, especially what those coordinators need to do is they need to be able to track the positive screenings and track who still needs to take their screening. So thinking back to what do I need to do this reporting? What data do we need to have? So we knew that we needed that screening form data and also some employee records to kind of bump up against that as well. As with any project, of course, as we learned more about the full picture, there were some challenges to work through. So one of these were the county health department guidelines. So if any of you were watching these or maybe working with them last summer, you would know that often these were really changing moment to moment, especially as districts were figuring out how can we open school again. That was just a constant conversation and really trying to figure out what the best way forward would be. So this was really great to coordinate with our health services department, who were very much plugged into the local health guidelines and knowing kind of things like what's the threshold for a potential outbreak, what kind of information do we really need to be tracking and organizing for contact tracing efforts, kind of all of that kind of piece. So we had to keep an eye on that and be flexible as that was changing. Another component of this project was identifying missing data, which is always kind of its own challenge. So remember, one of the questions is seeing who hasn't screened that needs to. So who's coming into a building, and we really need to know what their screening data is for that day. So that's not going to be captured on that Google form. The point is that that's missing from the form. So that was something that we had to work through, and that's where bringing in the employee records was really important to see who would we expect in a building on a day, and can we check if they all have completed their forms. And then identifying staff locations. So in most cases, we really were not used to keeping really tight tabs on where staff were reporting for a day, but we had to start doing that. So that's really important to do in terms of knowing, if you do have someone who ends up being symptomatic or having COVID, we need to know where they were and potentially who they were in contact with. Another nuance here is that we also have some staff members who might go to multiple locations in a day. Again, we've tried to, of course, cut back on that in COVID times, but it does still need to happen. So we need to be able to track where staff members are going and all of the locations that they might have been in a day. So having that context and kind of working through some of those challenges, I had a better idea of really what were the reporting questions that we needed to be able to answer with these Tableau reports. So the first one goes back to the original request, but the way I kind of articulated this to start building my report was, how might leaders monitor COVID leading indicators in buildings on a daily basis? And I'm going to jump over to Tableau to show this to you. Okay, so I have a demo workbook here to share. So just to note, I have randomized and anonymized all of the data here. So these are not actually Boulder Valley schools that I'm showing here, but this is what the report would look like that goes to our leadership team. So what we're showing here is this small multiple grid view of staff members who are screening yes. They've answered yes to any of the screening questions at all of our different on-site locations on a given date. I have a filter here so that a user can go in and look at any date within the past week. But in the live version, when they log in, it's going to default to today. So they get the most up-to-date data. So what I've got here within each square of the grid is a school. And for underneath the school name, what I'm showing is the first number is number of staff members who had a positive screening. And then out of the total number of staff members who screened into or reported into that building for that day. And you'll notice that I have a pretty simple color coding scheme here. It's not a very wide range of values, with the idea that even if there's 1 or 2 positive screenings, I really wanted that number to pop out. So the scale only goes up to 2 in order to really highlight the importance of, even if there's 1 or 2, that could be a leading indicator of a situation we need to follow up on. Could it be an outbreak? It just shows that's really important to focus on. So I want to go a little bit under the hood here and just talk a little bit more about this grid view. And I think this is an example of how awesome the Tableau community is. So this kind of grid view of the data is actually a tip that I learned from Stephanie, one of our wonderful hosts today. And if you actually go online and search for dynamic trellis, that's the term for it, You can find some really great articles within the Tableau community that really go into detail about how to set this up. So I just love that you can find these kind of awesome tips for creating different types of visualizations in Tableau. So I'll just quickly say kind of the general idea behind this grid. So notice that on my columns and rows, I have a couple of table calculations. So I'm just going to show this calculated field quickly. So for columns, so what I'm doing here is leveraging a couple of the Tableau table calcs. So specifically using the functions of index and size, and looking at that across my schools. And so what that is doing is basically creating a grid that is sized correctly for the number of schools that I have, and it places each school in order into that grid. And what's really nice about that approach is that if we go back to the dashboard, this puts everything onto one page. And that was really important for leadership to really have a quick overview one pager that they can see, and that I have scheduled now to go out to them in email every afternoon. So they actually get a PDF of this every day. The superintendent's cabinet all get this email, and they can just glance at that PDF and see the whole picture of what's happening in the district on a given day. So that approach worked really well for the leadership needs. All right. So, so that met the first request for leadership, but as I had learned, we also had these COVID coordinators who also needed data as well. So my next question that I worked on was, how might COVID coordinators easily track screening form completion and positive screenings within their building or department? So this, I built a different report, more specific for those COVID coordinators. All right. So here's what that looks like. The first thing I want to point out, one of the design decisions that I made, right in the title, I've put a couple of data questions so that a COVID coordinator gets in there and they can see exactly what this report is going to help them answer. So from this report, what they can answer is, who in my department either has or hasn't filled out a screening form today, and has anyone screened yes? Are there any positive screenings that I need to follow up on? When an actual coordinator goes in, this is going to default to their school or department. Again, the live version will default to today, but they can go back within the last week and look at this report. And then along the top, the first thing that I knew I wanted to build were these kind of key indicators to really call out what are the most important numbers that they need to know. So let me filter down to a fake school to show you. And I apologize, I realized when I randomized and anonymized my data that these numbers don't quite add up anymore, but they will give you an idea of what the situation looks like for a coordinator. So let's say I work at an elementary school. The first number that I need to know is, how many staff am I in charge of monitoring? So I've got 90 staff members, let's say. The next really important number is, how many of them had a positive screening today? So this is good, nobody has so far today. And then how many of those staff members did not submit a form? And if we keep looking to the right, I also include a list of who are those staff members that don't have a form, but are in my school. And so that's helpful to see. I can look down that list, and hopefully most of these people I know are working at home, so that's no big deal. But I can see if there is somebody on that list that maybe I see them coming into the building, I can have them stop and do their screening on the way in. And then down at the bottom, I've got the full list of all of my employees who did fill in their screening form. So I've got some information about who they are. Here's one of those employees who has actually gone to 2 buildings today. So that's important to know, where have they visited? And then I can see all of their responses to the screening questions. I also added a couple of filters on here. So the list will default to sort by name, but if I wanted to sort by timestamp, I could do that instead. And I can also filter that list down. So if I did have anyone with a positive screening, I could just pull those people quickly and see who they are. And I'll just note, I'll show those yeses. I've also color coded any positive screening so that it pops out pretty quickly from the list. So something I wanted to point out here as a tip that was helpful, and something that I didn't design into this initially, but iterated in over time, has to do with these key indicator numbers at the top. So originally I had set these up just to be text, so just to show the number on its own. But if you look now, it's kind of subtle, but this is actually a bar chart. And the reason I did that is so that I could have this numeric axis here. And what that does is, once I have this published up to server, this allows a user to go in and they can set a data-driven alert on that number. So, so that's a tip. You need to have that numeric axis visible on the published report, but once it is, they can go in, click on that, and then go through the dialog to set up their data-driven alert. And so I know a lot of the COVID coordinators have gone in and set that to like a threshold of 1, so that they know as soon as one person has screened positive, they'll get an email, they can pop into the report and see exactly who that is and start to follow up quickly. So that was something that was really helpful to add once I realized we needed it after starting the project. All right, and the last thing, I do want to share one more dashboard that kind of reflects how this project has evolved over time. So since the beginning of last fall, we have had students starting to return to buildings. So that's been a major consideration of how do we also consider the student element of this in the reporting. As I mentioned, we do also do screening for visitors as well. So that's another thing that our staff members need to keep an eye on. And also thinking about multiple leading indicators. So again, the screening form is a good piece of information, but are there other pieces of data that we could be looking at that help fill out the picture even more? So I'm going to share one more dashboard here. And so I've kind of thought of this as the COVID coordinator dashboard. So again, bringing together some of these multiple metrics and leading indicators to look at. So if you look down this report, I've kind of organized it into 3 rows. So we've got staff leading indicators, student leading indicators, and visitor leading indicators. So starting with the first chart in each of those rows, those are looking at the screening data. And so there's 2 sheets to look at the screening data for each group of people. So the first thing that I wanted to put was, again, what's like the top level indicator that's going to tell you about, for example, the staff screenings. And so in this dashboard, I've calculated that as a %. So with a little description underneath to unpack what does that mean. So this 1% is saying that 1% of staff screened positively on this day, and breaking that down, how many staff members was that? So it was 17 out of just over 1,900. So that gives kind of the high level snapshot for today. And then below that, I've included a 1-week trend of that number of staff with positive screenings, so that we can see how is that trending recently. Is it going up? Is it going down? Is that something we want to keep a closer eye on? So similarly, just below that, this first box, these 2 charts for students, this is also looking at the student screening data. Our student screening is in our student information system, Infinite Campus, so that's what that's telling us here. But same same idea, we're looking at what percentage of students, breaking that down by numbers, had a positive screening on a given day, and then what was the 1 week trend looking back. And then just the same idea for visitors, again, so keeping this very consistent of what it's showing. So the one I mentioned wanting to look at multiple leading indicators. So one other thing that I've added here are the student absences. So another possible way that we might see if there is something like a potential outbreak or situation that we need to know about. So what this is showing, again, at the top level, I've put this into a percentage. And what that is showing are students who are in person in school, who are on site, who had an illness-related absence. I've also rolled in excused and unexcused, just with the idea that if, potentially we don't have that illness documented on that day, but if we do see a spike just in general of students who are absent, we'd want to keep an eye on that. So student absences, again, breaking down the numbers and again, showing that 1 week trend. And then other pieces that you'll see are not here yet, but that we've talked about adding here. Another student indicator could be health room visits on a given day. And then for staff, we've also kind of tossed around the idea of substitute requests. Again, as a leading indicator of staff being out potentially for an illness. All right. So just a couple conclusions about this project. I think it has been really successful in that we've been able to get timely and actionable data out to both our leaders and those COVID coordinators. So they can be really keeping a pulse on the data and monitoring it daily and even hour by hour throughout the day. This data has been a really important component of our compliance with our health guidelines and just helping us to be organized and have, again, have a pulse on and really see the whole picture of what is happening with our screening data and helping us with all of those processes related to that. So again, this has been great information to help with that downstream piece of contact tracing, communication within our community, and deploying supports out to schools as well. All right, so that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much, and I can take any questions.
All right, thank you, Claire. That was a fabulous presentation as always. We greatly appreciate you kind of taking one for the team and being our very first national K-12 presenter. So kudos and thank you. So there has been just a few questions out there and I'm not going in order. I'm going to present them kind of clustered in the area. So this one is more kind of technical. The person who sent this in says, we used Google Sheets to track massive amounts of daily data, and it only lasted about 2 weeks before the Google Sheets stopped refreshing data coming in from Google Forms. A form had one question and answered by 25,000 people every day. It would eventually get there, but it sometimes took up to a week to load. Did you encounter an issue that was similar, and how did you resolve it?
Yes, and that was another early consideration we had to work through. And I will reveal my secret weapon is my colleague, David Tomaszek in IT. He's our data warehouse designer. So I worked with him and others on the IT team who really were thinking about this issue of using a Google form to collect this data. Just knowing that it is, yes, it's a huge amount of data. That ends up in a Google spreadsheet, which is not always our favorite format to work with. So they actually helped with what we've been doing is pulling that data out of the Google Sheet and into our data warehouse. And that's been really important also to have, to create a more permanent record of that data. So if we do have to go back within the past few weeks, for example, potentially for contact tracing, we know that we have that data stored. So I think working with a way to get that data out of the Google Sheet into another more robust format was really important. Even with that, we have still, we do have that process going, but we've also run into, again, kind of volume issues with using a Google form. Just from having that running for, a few months, it does end up filling up, even though we're pulling out of it. So, so there definitely have been some bumps and tricks for working with Google Forms over time.
Thank you. There's another techie question. How did you account for staff leaving the school district, and did you refresh the staff list?
Yeah, so that's where I mentioned kind of the two main data sources that we're using for this. The main one, of course, is the form data, but we do bring in employee records. And so we pull that from our HR system. And that is also, we're updating that daily to keep that refreshed. And I guess another thing I'll add there too is we did have to do a bit of legwork as well to figure out, so that COVID coordinator, that's not a role that we've had in our HR system before. So that was sort of a process to figure out, like, for a given department, who's the COVID coordinator. And that's kind of the row level security piece of it, almost, to say that coordinator goes with that department, goes with those staff members. So it was sort of putting all of those pieces together.
Perfect. There's another one that's tied similar. Let's see, how often do you pull the data from the Google Sheets and into your data warehouse?
So that is, I think we're down to like a 15-minute process, maybe a little bit faster. So we're doing that very frequently throughout the day, really for those COVID coordinators who need to have basically as close to live data as possible to be watching that.
Perfect. David is chiming in 10 minutes.
Thank you, David.
So awesome.
Yes, he's made that as fast as possible, which is great.
Awesome. Another one that is a little more on the techie side of things, and this transitions more to the Tableau side. How did you set up the spacing of the various worksheets on the last dashboard that you had shown, the one with the various percents and trend lines for the week?
Yes, so that is using one of my favorite, I would say unglamorous, but totally favorite workhorse features, with which are the containers, the horizontal and vertical containers in Tableau. Those are like a lifesaver for formatting. So I wonder if we can, sorry, I'm not remembering how to show like the, here it is, layout. So the item hierarchy, if we were to dig into this, I think you would just see how many containers I really have in here. So that was definitely, I mean, it's not like a quick process necessarily. Once I sort of had the layout in mind of what I wanted to do, I really leveraged a lot of those different containers to kind of get everything to fit together. And then also in using those, let me see if I can get a good example here. Select that container. There is this feature to distribute contents evenly. That has also been really helpful to just make things look nice and clean and even. So I would say, yeah, like definitely leverage those layout containers and look into some of these features about distribute contents evenly and sizing to get those right.
Awesome. Yes, the layout containers can be a frustration. And so I had seen someone else present, you're either a floating, or you like things kind of hard coded and setting heights and widths of everything. So if that's a new learning piece for you, be patient. There are rewards and just to make that visually symmetrical and to things really lay out really nice and tidy. And build that consistent template going forward. So yeah, thank you for kind of showing that behind the scenes a little bit. Another question, let's see here if there's still a little bit more technical. Let's go ahead. There's quite a few coming in, so I apologize. I was organized in now, so these may not be as organized. Question is, was the randomized and anonymized data created in Tableau or in SQL?
We have, so sorry, I'm just pausing because, so we have, David again helped set up a randomized data set within our warehouse. So basically just bringing in random names that we can swap out our real staff names. So I'm not as sure of the process of that. I will say I actually just created like a Google sheet in this case for the randomized or anonymized school names and join those into our real schools for this data just to cover those up. So it can be, you know, you don't have to get super fancy with it. It can be as simple as just I pulled a list of fake school names and joined that to our real school to anonymize.
We just have a few more minutes. There's a little bit more time allowed here. Here is one that says, how do you know which locations a staff member is visiting? One challenge that this person had faced when building out a similar health dashboard was that they wanted to just base it off of a list of staff members at each site, but there are some cases such as central staff members who are visiting a site or someone who works at multiple sites that wouldn't show up in our system. And do you face any challenges about sharing of potentially sensitive or private health data?
Yeah, so for that first question, I should have said this. We actually, that is a question on our screening form. We have them actually put in their visited location for the day. And so actually, like if we were to go under the hood, each staff member has two types of locations. So the one that we pull from the form, we've been calling that like their visited location. That could be multiple, like I showed. So that's a self-report. We also have, we call it the home location, and that is tied to the HR record. So we're actually leveraging both of those locations, but having the self-reported one was really important. Because again, we just weren't used to tracking for most of our employees where we would expect them to be. So we have them tell us. Also, those fields are important for the privacy question too, because yes, that was definitely something that came up and that we discussed a lot over the course of this project. And so that's where that designating specific COVID coordinators who that group did receive specific training from our health services department. And part of that was about the data privacy piece of this. But once we had our designated COVID coordinators that we could link to specific home locations, we set up row level security to make sure that only those people were seeing only the staff members that they needed to. So yeah, that was definitely an important piece to consider.
Thank you. And there's one more that I'm going to throw out there before we transition to the next set of speakers. And know that if Clare is not answering at this moment, once we wrap up with this last question, she'll be able to go in, and whether it's her or David on her behalf, go in and answer some of these questions. And if it's still not answered in the time that we're together, know that we will follow up with questions, the answers as well. So the last one I'm going to leave with, which could be weighing on a lot of shoulders, is so for Boulder Valley, do you use IC, Infinite Canvas, to limit what users can see as far as security?
Do we use, so using IC for also the Tableau security piece, I'm guessing? Yeah,
so maybe just in general, talk a little bit about that security piece.
Yeah, so yeah, again, our security model is something that we took a good amount of time on, a few years ago when we started our Tableau implementation, and is something we have continually revised as we found new use cases where we needed to do that. So yeah, our general security model. We are an infinite campus district. And we do kind of use a combination of our data in infinite campus. Of course, that's where the student information is tied to schools, but we also have to pull from our HR system where we have employees tied to locations. And so between those two, that's where we can start to make those links between employees, which location are you assigned to, kind of tying into which students can you see. That's a really simplified way. There's quite a lot more nuance to it, also having to do with employee roles. For example, a principal can see everybody in a school, a teacher can see their classroom. So again, using infinite campus roster data. So we do pull heavily from both IC and our HR records to organize that together. Again, we've got that, we have kind of user security structures built into our warehouse that sort of make those row level associations between staff members and which students they can see. But yeah, it's definitely been a process, and something, if you want to follow up, I'm happy to talk more about this as well. I always like to mention that we have benefited so much from sharing from other districts of their approaches to this. And so I'm always happy to share what we're doing if it can help you out with that. But it's definitely a really important kind of under the hood piece, but it touches everything that we publish in Tableau.
Perfect. Thank you, Claire, for wrapping that up for us. So again, if Claire did not get to your questions or if I did not close on your behalf, she is able to go in and respond to those. And if time doesn't allow, we will regroup and make sure that all of your questions that are weighing on you right now do get answered. So I'm going to go ahead and transition it back to Thomas to get us queued up for the next one.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. And wow, thank you so much, Claire. That was a really awesome presentation. I love the data-driven alerts tip. I'm definitely going to figure out ways to use that in the future. And that has me excited for our next two speakers, Dan Hess and Tweezy Ravi. So Dan, they're both from KIPP, Northern California. Dan is the director of data. He's a former teacher and a lifelong data nerd in the K-12 education. He's been working there for 15 years now. And Tweezy, she has worked as a data analyst for KIPP NorCal for the past 2 years. She's developed a passion for education and a drive to create a more accessible and equitable education system here in the US. Outside of work, you can find her climbing in the gym or rock climbing in general, Tweezy?
It is just climbing at the gym for now.
All right, for now. Or writing and reading at her favorite coffee shops. So with that, I transition it over to both of y'all. And I just want to remind everyone, you've been doing a wonderful job at it so far, but ask all your questions in the Q&A box.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I'm going to present my screen now. All right. Claire, thank you so much again for the presentation. I learned a lot from it. I'm excited about the data you're using. I'm also excited to be here with you all. I'm grateful to be sharing a little bit about the tools that we use at KIPP, Northern California Public Schools. Dan and I and several other folks have worked on trying to create a tool specific for the distance learning context that will help us understand how we can better support our students. And today we're going to walk through that and share a little bit about this project and the tool itself. We'll start off with some introductions. Dan will give us some context and purpose for why we built this tool, go through how we engaged with our stakeholders and our design process overall. I'll transition and do a tool demo and discuss some of the learnings that we had as we were building this tool. And then lastly, close up with what we've seen as the impact so far. So as Thomas has already sort of introed, thank you. My name is Tweezy. I'm a data analyst. I've been working with KIPP for the past 2 years now. Was a consultant before that. I've cared very deeply about learning and education for as long as I can remember, and particularly curious about how we can create an education system that's more equitable. I think data is such a powerful way of doing that, and data visualization in particular creates an accessible way of providing that data to our educators. Dan?
Thanks, Tweezy. So proud to be here presenting with you. Just a clarification on Thomas's note, I haven't been at KIPP 15 years. I have been in the ed space for 15 years. 6 of those were in the classroom when I first started out as a high school teacher before pivoting over to the data side. Been at KIPP now a little over 2 years. And we've just really seen the impact data can have when we use it to illuminate the things that might not otherwise get seen. So we've tried to build a data culture around this concept of like data as a flashlight. And so what we're trying to do this time around, the flashlight's got a very narrow focus. So we're trying to turn on the full floodlights, the spotlight, and be able to see the whole child. That's really what we're trying to kind of like pivot our thinking and a holistic approach of looking across a bunch of different things for a student. Talk a little bit about KIPP Northern California, just to kind of contextualize who we are here. Together with families and communities, KIPP Public Schools Northern California creates joyful, academically excellent schools that prepare students with the skills and confidence to pursue the paths they choose, whether that's college or career and beyond, so they can lead fulfilling lives and create a more just world. We've got 16 free public elementary, middle, and high schools across the Bay Area, and now we're expanding into Stockton in the coming year as well. Go to our next slide here. Thank you. Our schools educate over 6,500 students. Our students and their families live in neighborhoods across Northern California and speak over 25 languages at home. We're proud that our school communities reflect the rich histories and diversity of our region. In the COVID context, we've had to adapt KIPP's strategy to fit distance learning. Prior to this, we had this concept of attend, belong, grow, and really grounding those as they feed into each other. In the COVID context, our approach to distance learning has had to bring together our math and English programs, our independent reading, as well as wellness and progress check-ins with teachers, Google Classroom lessons and activities. Each of our schools have really focused on shifting our focus not from necessarily attendance, but to access. There's in a normal year, the entry point into school is actually being in the classroom, but here it's really about making sure that everyone has equal access to these learning opportunities. And so to support that, our schools have distributed Chromebooks, hotspots, online resource recommendations for our schools, learning plans to all of our families. We've built structures for check-ins with our students and establishing distance learning advisors to set up support for our students. So while attendance is fundamental to learning success, and we're still obviously measuring attendance, what that's meant and how that's looked with asynchronous and synchronous attendance has been different. But we know that access is fundamental. That hasn't shifted our belief in supporting the well-being of our students through support and communication or focusing on growth and success in learning, but it has had to shift our approach to doing that. In that context, we wanted to look at how we could create an integrated approach to identifying kids who would benefit from re-engagement and intervention. How do we intervene? How do we know if it's working? We know this is a particularly difficult time to keep students engaged in their learning with all that's going on in the world. And to do that, we partnered with our operations, our academics, our school culture teams to really supplement our existing student support cycle in this context. And the role that data plays in here is really heavily on the identification. We want to look at these various qualifiers that we can use to identify students who would benefit most from additional supports because they're really struggling in this context. Couple that with, it's not enough just to find those students, but how are we going to actually intervene and support them? And so that's really where our academics and our school culture teams came in to provide resources and to lift up the best practices that a number of our schools are already doing to apply that and share that around our region. And then finally, really making sure that there's this complete cycle of follow-up, tracking those interventions and approaches and ensuring student success, and then beginning that over and over again and realizing this isn't a linear process, but one that has to be repeated. And while identification was important, we had to figure out what data was going to be most pertinent in the distance learning context. And we heard from stakeholders that this was live and synchronous attendance in particular. We want to make sure that students are showing up to those times when they can have live engagement with teachers. From a asynchronous lens, it was really looking at assignment completion rates in our learning management system, in this case, Google Classroom for our grades 3 to 12, as well as course grades to really highlight the outcome of those other indicators. Some of the things we're not looking at yet in this tool are interim assessments or SEL or belonging survey data. And the reasons for that, one, we're in the midst of shifting our survey strategy this year to be in tighter loops with a pulse survey strategy. And so we're just now getting that data in. So we're looking to bring that into a V2. And then with assessments, we have a lot of strong infrastructure already in place to look at assessment. And what we found is, that data, the other measures that we're looking at in this tool are much more like timely, they change frequently, they're formative. And so comparing that to assessment data, which is more summative, periodic, didn't have the same impact on the timelines in which we want stakeholders engaging with this new tool. So like I mentioned before, we did have to partner broadly. One way that I wanted to kind of think about, we have this concept of like a regional support office that supports our schools. And data is really like a hub at a regional support office, connecting the work of teams on operations, on school culture, on special education, academics, and our leaders who train and support our school leaders. Across, we have sort of a lot of those parallels on the school teams themselves at our sites, whether that's our directors of school operations, our school leaders, our teachers, our mental health counselors, our ed specialists, and even advisors who I've colored here orange, but kind of sit in between that school culture and academic lens here. So sort of bridging that gap. That's really required, tight partnership to ensure that we're engaging with a lot of different voices. We really want to bring an equity lens to that work as well, and make sure that all the voices of our users are being uplifted, and so that we can hear their needs and really center the user in our design process. One of the needs that we identified in this process was first we kind of saw this need surfaced by our high school school leader managers, and one in particular, who really was vocal about the need to sort of measure and ensure student engagement was high during distance learning. And that was really tied into our org strategic priorities, as I pointed before. But we really wanted to make sure that we're solving for a problem. We have all this data. We have grades, we have attendance, we have assignment completion, but they're sort of distinct and they're separated, and that can be challenging to identify student needs across multiple areas and really hone in on how best to support them. So our goal here was to really bring those together. And we'd also heard, as part of our work with stakeholders, that many of our tools allow for like snapshotting or looking at sort of where we are now. But there's this real desire for a lot of these indicators to look at how that's over time, and not just this like year-over-year trend, but this really tight cycles so that we can see the impact of interventions that are tried, as well as being able to see those trends at a student level, not just at a school-wide trends. So in general, I try to paint a picture here of our design process not being like straight or linear in one direction, but sort of bumpy, a little bit of detours along the way. And in some cases, probably some more loop-de-loops here of like coming back to things. But we like to think about moving through this from pain points, identifying those with stakeholders, hearing their voices, and then bringing them into the process of brainstorming solutions and really like opening that up for a lot of different ideas. That being said, we're a small team, we're scrappy, but we have limited time and capacity and the ability to meet all of those needs. And so a big part of that problem for us is prioritizing those ideas and getting the right scope. Because yeah, we'd love to like spend the time like iterating and getting the perfect tool. But if I get a tool out 2 years from now, that's not going to be effective for on the ground right now. It really needs to be timely. And so we have to work with them to really, figure out what's going to be the most impactful functionality, what's going to have, the most impact right now, our MVP, if you will. And so that work often, requires shifting our focus. So, one thing that we heard from stakeholders here was, they wanted the ability to export that data to build it into tools and processes they're already using their school sites. They wanted to look at, is this impacting students' progress to graduation? And while we have another tool that supports counselors in that, it was going to be challenging to merge that infrastructure into this tool. And so we recognized that would be a valuable feature, but we put that on the back burner as part of this prioritization for a later iteration so we could focus on those highest impact functionality now. Another approach that we bring into our process here to get sort of tight feedback cycles is wireframing. And we want to kind of compartmentalize how we get feedback. We want people to react to the design, not necessarily the data. As soon as I put numbers in front of people, they start looking at the numbers and focusing on those, and we shift our attention away from what the actual design is. And we really want to get that fast iteration and make sure we have the right design before we move into like a development and a build stage. So that's been really important for us. In the remote context, one way that we've adapted our process is to use less pen and paper. That's not to say we don't use that still, but more tools for async collaboration. So, really lightweight tools like Google Slides, where we'll use simple shapes and colors to create wireframes, but then we can allow different stakeholders access to that and to provide comments in an asynchronous manner that we can respond to and really iterate fast on. Likewise, once we've got a prototype tool in place and we begin QA and testing, accuracy and the effectiveness of the tool really is what establishes trust with our stakeholders. We place a really high value on our data being reliable. And so to that end, we spend a lot of time before we launch tools going through this QA process. And Tweezy has really introduced a new approach for us, particularly in our remote context, of using a central document to capture all that QA and feedback and testing with screenshots, so that we can help analysts quickly prioritize, resolve those issues, and communicate the status of those fixes before we go live. Moving into launch, it's as a growing organization, it's harder and harder to scale the individualized support and training for new tools. And that's been especially true in the remote context, but to some extent, it's always been true because our remote, our regional service office is remote from our schools. And so we've always kind of operated in some remote capacity, although before we used to have the ability to like show up at their door and help out. Can't necessarily do that right now. But communication has been really key in that process. We've leveraged existing structures like our different newsletters for different audiences to announce when tools are coming live. We have a data portal that acts as a central place for all of our schools to access our tools. We've also jumped into existing learning spaces that like communities of practice for our school leaders and our directors of operations. So we can jump in and not make another demand of their time, but really take a step into a space that's already committed to that. One thing we've been trying out this time around is building really short, punchy screencasts that are sort of like how-tos of how to use the tool, so we don't have to spend time training. Obviously, we want our tools to be self-explanatory, but every now and again, a little bit of support helps there too. And to do that and to preserve student anonymity and school privacy, like Claire mentioned, we've set up anonymous and obfuscated data sources so that we can use those in our demos, and that we'll be using today when Tweezy presents. Just using really simple desktop recording software and making sure that that permissions for sharing those allows us to quickly get that out to everyone. I'm gonna hand it back over to Tweezy.
Great, thank you, Dan. I'm going to switch over so that we can take a look at this tool, the tool demo. It's going to be on our data portal here. To go back to the purpose of this tool, we're focused on looking at engagement in a distance learning context, and we have school leaders and regional folks as well, and other school teams using this report to see high level how are our students doing, and segment them by the number of flags they have, and then be able to drill down and look at that student deep dive. So our tool here includes two main story points. We have student supports as well as a data export. We have the features here is one, just a brief explanation of what this tool does, our filters at the top, floating bar quartiles used to show students based off of number of flags. We have a student list, and then these here I'll show you in a minute, provide deep dives into student information. So today I'm going to walk you through the report as if I'm going to pretend I'm a user at one of our schools, and show you how this tool is used, and also talk about some of the cool features that Tableau has that we used, that we were able to leverage. So starting off with the very top, how we use the flags. So we worked with our stakeholders to identify what were the main criteria that we wanted to look at. And Dan spoke a little bit about this. One is framing it around attendance or access here, and our students actually attending their courses a daily basis, and also specific courses and periods throughout the day. Second, are our students completing the assignment? So are they doing the work, and are they engaged? And lastly, grades as a way to measure what are the quality of those assignments that they're completing. So I'm gonna select a specific school. We have them anonymized here for now. And as a school leader or as someone at the school, you'll only be able to see your school information here. Looking at this top bar here, we've identified the breakdown of students who have either 1, 2, 3, or 0 flags. Now I can filter for a specific grade if I want to. I can also just filter for students with an IEP. This view by allows you to look at comparisons, not just by grade. So right now it's looking at grade, but you can also look at subgroup information. This new to KIPP is something that we added this year. So anyone who's first year it is with KIPP, who's starting off their KIPP journey in a virtual context, we want to make sure that those students in particular we are supporting. As well as this last one, small group supervision. We have students who are actually going back into school already. This tool helped us identify specific students to support in an in-person context. So we wanted to be able to look at those students in particular. All right, so if I am, let's say, supporting the 7th grade team, and I want to look at the different supports, there are different types of interventions you can do with students based off of how many flags they have. And so let's say I want to look at the students who have 2 flags. We're using action filters here to get from this chart to filter for our student list. And then from there, we can select a specific student to get all of their information here on the right. So I want to look at this student's overall overview here. So some demographic information, as well as a summary of the metrics we're looking at, and then deep dive into attendance, assignment completion, and lastly, grades as well. So if I'm looking at each of these individual charts, I'm going to go into attendance here. What you're seeing is there's overall attendance for that student, so like daily attendance, but you can also drill down into the courses. And we the operations team work on a process this year to have teachers submitting attendance by period so that we could understand not just trends overall, but trends within specific classes and times of day. So you have the course, so an advisory, the student has attended 95% of those courses. Relative to the change in the last 2 weeks, it looks like that attendance has dropped slightly, but we can also see what that looks like on a day-to-day basis for the last 2 weeks here, highlighting where that student has missed school. Then we're going down to Google Classroom assignment completion. Again, it's by course. You can see the overall percentage of assignments completed and that change in the last 2 weeks. And then grades here. So you can see grades by term for the current year. And if that student was with us at KIPP, you can also see the grades for the last year. Some of the things that I want to highlight that were cool features of Tableau that we were able to implement. One, we brought in these Unicode font characters to very quickly show where the trends are, up or down. We're sort of doing the same thing or similar thing to highlight or make it really easy for the users to highlight the trends here by color coding. So you can see where that student is absent or where they've missed assignments because it's showing up as red here. The third thing I want to talk about is the ability to import color palettes. So we have KIPP colors used here, this blue and this red. Those are from our KIPP color palette that we were able to upload into Tableau. One of the design features that I want to speak about is, you might not have noticed, but in our wireframe that Dan showed earlier, we had drawn out spark lines for these for the synchronous period attendance and Google Classroom assignment completion. This is part of the process we were iterating on design and going back and thinking about that prototype and what really makes sense for our users. The spark lines, most of the time for these metrics, they're going to be plateauing towards a certain point of the year. And when we looked at this, we didn't think it was that useful for our stakeholders, but what might be more relevant to them was to have a recent snapshot of that student's information. And so I know as a data community, we really love spark lines that are very aesthetically pleasing, but from a user's perspective, this was much more effective. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the tool demo and go back to our presentation here. Throughout this process, we learned a lot about some of the features in Tableau, some of the features in the data source, particularly around how we can collaborate better as a team using these tools. I'm going to let Dan speak to how we collaborated on the data source piece first.
Sure. My background in strengths often lie on the software and the data engineering side of this. I'm probably the David de Clare in that scenario there before, working on the data warehouse side. But as we've grown, one of the things we try to do is apply some of those best practices for collaboration, not just from the engineering side, but into the analysis side. And so we use GitHub pretty strong, heavily to do async collaboration and code review. And so what we've tried to do is take that, not just where we're doing this in like a Python with our ETL processes, but also into our SQL, into our data warehouse development so that we can partner very closely. And so this is an opportunity where when we're building data sources, we actually like chime in with each other, support each other on our builds. But also what that allows us to do, it gives a lot of visibility into that process and that design process so that we can start to consolidate a lot of our data sources. So we often have, individual analysts working on a dashboard and building, the underlying data source for that dashboard, rather than thinking holistically about all of our reports and our ecosystem. And so by bringing everyone together and having that kind of shared vision, and in particular something like this that it has to bring together a lot of different disparate data sources into one, really allows us to like revisit, revise, refactor our data sources, and an opportunity for Tweezy and I to like dig in together and even do some capacity building and working together that way. So it's really streamlined a lot of our processes and allowed us to highlight where we need to consolidate data sources. We definitely uncovered some issues with like trying to improve how we look at grades and making sure the way that we look at grades is consistent across all of our reports, because a lot of what we're doing here is taking existing reports and its functionality and bringing it together and making sure that those mirror each other exactly. Again, back to that data quality and accuracy important. You want to see what you see in one report is exactly what you see in another.
On the note of the collaboration and working together on one thing, we tried to replicate that process in Tableau as well. The project, we were at the start of the school year. Our teams wanted to very quickly be able to support students, and so we had to get this tool up and running quickly, which meant that typically we have one person who's the primary owner of a workbook, and then a reviewer who reviews things on our Tableau server. This time we had a little bit of a breakout where I worked on a lot of this report, but Dan pitched in and worked on pieces of it as well. And so we did that by we used Tableau server as sort of our GitHub here, where we would store that as a place for to track the progress of the dashboards and have one single place where our product can be. And so we would publish it, Dan would take it down, add pieces. We also leveraged the ability to copy and paste sheets from one to another, so that if Dan had to work on something while I was also working on it, we can do that very easily. The last learning and something that was instrumental in getting this tool up and running was Tableau's ability to blend data. So our philosophy around data and setting up the data so that it can be successful and smooth in Tableau is that we try to do a lot of this work in our SQL upfront, so in our data sources. So for this report in particular, we had to take 3 different data sources that were all at a different level. So we had grades, attendance, and assignment completion. one approach we were thinking of doing is bringing these together and using level of detail calculations to aggregate the data and define that the number of flags for student in Tableau. What we found was a simpler approach was actually pulling that out and doing that information or doing that summarization in the SQL side first. So we created a primary data source that was one row per student per year that had the flags for the students. And then we joined those to secondary data sources on the Tableau side. And so that data blending piece was really helpful in making sure that we could get all of this information, despite the fact that they were at all different levels of information. All right, so the impact. It's been a short time since this report has been rolled out, but we're seeing a lot of amazing, getting a lot of amazing feedback on it already. So the one first thing I'd highlight is we do track usage of all of our reports. Dan has actually created a usage tracking report that we're able to filter by owner or filter by specific report and see who are our top users for that report and which roles are maybe not using that report, who we expect to be. For our usage, we expected all school leaders to be in it, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing 17 school leaders actively using this report. At the high school level in particular, this second column here, school leader managers have built a protocol into their weekly check-ins with school leaders. So they're actually analyzing this data, surfacing trends, choosing students to focus on creating action plans. For the third, this process, one of our school leader managers shared with me that this tool has allowed that one of our high schools to reduce failure rates by 30%, which is amazing for just the short amount of time it's been out already. And then lastly, although this wasn't the original intent of, we didn't intend this report to be used this way, but we're excited that it was able to support the development of our reopening strategy. So we can identify students who needed to come back for in-person learning. And so we actually have 49 students across a few of our middle schools who are back in the classroom. So overall, I think it's really exciting to see people using this tool, people excited about this data and the kind of impact that it's having in such a short amount of time. I think Dan mentioned this up front. We're going to continue iterating on it because this is a work in progress as we get more data and we get more information, going back to like social emotional learning and belonging data. We'd love to bring that in and continue to provide that more holistic view of a student. That's all we have today. I think we can open it up for Q&A.
Perfect, thank you. Had to find my mute button here. There are several questions and we have just under 10 minutes to get through some of those. Some of these might take a little bit longer to answer. So just like I had said before, things that are not answered here in the moment, we will make sure that you do get the response that you were seeking. So the first one that I'll bring to the team is on the technical aspect of it. Early in the presentation, you had referenced kind of your process for development, that reporting lifecycle. What tools do you use to wireframe Tableau dashboards? And do you almost always wireframe outside of Tableau before actually building in Tableau?
Yeah, we go pretty low tech, you know. Pen and paper used to be one that I would really reach for a lot of the time, but we've definitely like tried to avoid some of the like like overly complex, like use a system for wireframe, or use a a SAS tool or something for wireframing, and so we've used things like Google slide decks, where we'll just sort of design a layout and then use that like comment functionality that all Google Docs have, so they kind of go back and forth, ping individual users, share it with the right stakeholders, and gather our thoughts that way. Those are kind of like some of our main ones. I've used Lucid charts as well in the past to do some wireframing, but really try to keep it low tech, really less about the technology we're using and more about making sure that we can do it quickly and get that feedback really, really tight.
Yeah, it's a great point. with them focusing on the concept and not that data, which is a good
I
reminder.
mean, Tableau is easy enough to build a prototype in. So like, it is my instinct to just jump in there and start building. And so it's like, we have to oftentimes kind of like, force ourselves to be a little bit more intentional about that.
Yeah, absolutely. What student information system do you use?
We're in PowerSchool.
Okay. Another simple question. How many SQL developers do you have?
Every one of my team is a SQL developer. Part of my, this kind of approach that our team takes to this is that to be a full stack data team, and so that means that, while we all have different areas of strengths and expertise, we do try to like move up and down from everything from ETL all the way up to Tableau and everything in between. So Python, SQL, Tableau are like our key tool set for development. But everyone on the team is building those skills in one direction or the other, and sort of meeting in the middle.
We have 2 or 6 people total, if you're curious.
So one tied to that, and it's kind of related to the staffing or skill set. How long did it take it from requirements to completion?
Trying to look back at our calendar, and maybe Tweezy, you can speak to this more, but I think it was about 6 weeks from the time it came from like someone's like brain to like when it was out the door. But it was really about like, just after school started, obviously we would have loved to have this like right as school started. The focus at the beginning of the year really was around like, we already had tools to look at Google assignment completion. We really wanted to hyper focus on access and making sure we built some provisioning and rostering processes to keep our Google Classroom and our student information system, PowerSchool, in nightly sync. And so that was like a big focus to make sure that our schools didn't have to have to do all the lift to get all of their students enrolled and to provide day-to-day updates as students are coming in and getting enrolled on a day-to-day basis and make sure everyone has access. So access was our key focus, but we very quickly began to hear from stakeholders in, I think, about August, September, the need for this. So this was out the door in October. And so now starting to get those initial feedbacks, and we'll be moving into a spring like revamp to bring in that belonging data once the pulse surveys begin to start to get data back.
I'll kind of ask a follow-up question that could be on the shoulders of some as they hear, all of your staff or, your team has that SQL background and you have the skill set within that team to make this happen. What would be a recommendation that you would have for a district who may be newer, maybe doesn't have the technical sense to the data warehouse side or the Tableau side? What would be some recommendations to get them moving forward, even if they don't have that technical team to give them that support structure?
It's a tricky question. Learn things. We're an education organization. Continuous learning is a big part of who we are. I think everyone on my team values growth and learning as a really core metric. I'm a former teacher. A big part of what I bring to the team is actually being able to train and teach. And so everyone on our team kind of takes on that role and pushes each other. And Tweezy has been organizing a great internal PD series on, stepping back from our day-to-day work to kind of stretch our Tableau muscles and try out new techniques. And so I've been playing around with Sankey charts, and Tweezy's working on some network graphs. And so really just trying to keep that sort of like the fun and the joy element of learning on the team, so that they're pushing stuff in those directions. I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but
yeah, I should say when I started here 2 years ago, I didn't have much experience either on SQL or Tableau, and Dan and the team made it very easy to learn. I also think that going back to your question, there are ways of, if you're familiar with Excel, some of this can be done there as just a starting point. And there's visualization using like pivot tables and whatnot. It's not as robust as I would say like having a data warehouse infrastructure in Tableau, but it's definitely a great starting point.
And I'm gonna have one final question because we do have just a few more key points to wrap up our session today. Many of the questions, at a glance, it appears that Dan and Tweezy could probably, give you those quick typed in responses. One question that could be resonating with others, on your dashboard demo that you did, you had that data download button. Can you provide just a high level insight into what users would have been able to do on that second story tab?
Yeah, the data export, those are for folks who, some of our operations teams, they actually pull out that data and they put it into a tracker so that teachers and advisors can interact with it. And so how that tool is being used is someone will go in and they'll get all of that student information that's up to date. So the high level summary of the metrics and the student demographics, downloaded into a CSV or Excel file, and then uploaded into a Google Sheets. I think one of the benefits of that is just that Tableau, there's right now not a way to interact with it and add comments and have users make it like more customized. So I think the export really allows for that.
We have a strong data culture. A lot of our school site folks are very data savvy, and so they don't want to be, sort of walled gardened behind only being able to use the tools we develop for them. So we want to make sure they have access to that underlying data that's theirs and permission for them. And so we allow them to export the data they need so that they can do what they want to do with that data, which also helps us operate in a partnership with them as they prototype new ideas and bubble up those best practices that are working for them. Then we can use that and translate the products that support our entire region.
Yeah. I love that. That's awesome. So I just asked that Dan and Tweezy kind of take a look at those open questions. I believe those that are sitting out there are intended towards yours. I believe that Claire had answered all of hers, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to go ahead and ask that Thomas pull up our last few slides.
There you go.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and paste these links into the chat as well. As a reminder, you'll also be getting a copy of the PowerPoint or a link to the presentation post. We are under the assumption that we'll have that link ready in 24 to 48 hours. So be looking for that. And so we just appreciate you all being here. Tableau is amazing, and there are so many ways to get connected. So we do have a couple links that are available to you. We have our group hub. We have our community forums, which is a great place to make those networking pieces, to pose questions. Even if you don't have a question, if you're able to log in and help one of your peers out across the country, across the world, that would be amazing. Get connected on LinkedIn as well. And again, I will post these links here. I will do it. They're in my paste queue, maybe not. I'll do it here in a second. Multitasking. And let's see here. The next slide, if you can go ahead and transition for me. And Dan alluded to this, right? We're all about education. And so Tableau does offer a variety of ways to kind of get up to date on what's new. So there are a variety, solution pages, use case. There's a great Tableau workbook that's out on public for you to kind of see what your peers across the country are doing in specific areas. View to see the workbook that they have. And if you have follow-up questions, reach out to them and see if they're able to share any of those learning and insights. We have webinars posted, get tied in with the higher ed too. You all have, a common heart and soul in this. And so lean in and listen to what those higher education folks also have. And then as just kind of a heads up, we will be planning another meeting on April 14th. We kind of have to save the date here for you. We just picked a date yesterday. We still have a question mark, but April 14th is kind of where we're headed. We are looking for a June date, probably mid, and then maybe a September, October for a fall. So if you would like to help us lead, if you want to be one of the leadership team in here and help guide some of these conversations, we encourage you to reach out to us. We also would encourage you to reach out if you'd like to present. at one of the future meetings. We will be sending out a call for presenters and that follow-up email where you can submit to request. We had some initial great ones as well who had wanted to speak at this one. So there's great interest, and we are super excited about how we have a lot of participation or excitement around that participation. So be looking for emails. I believe Cassidy will be sending things out initially on our behalf, but we are super excited to kind of what's to come for this large group. We had well over 200 on the call today, and we know that we're going to expand even more. Cassidy, Thomas, and I will be here for you, so reach out, email. We're happy to get you in contact with those who spoke or to help you network. And so I'll just turn it over to Thomas to kind of say his thanks as well.
Yeah, no, thank you all so much for attending today. I know we're at time, and I just wanted to say I'm really looking forward to expanding this even more. Just from the questions and the conversation that happened today, I can really tell that people were very engaged, and I appreciate that so much. Don't hesitate to reach out. I definitely hope that more of you are interested in becoming involved, either as a presenter or as contributing to as part of the leadership team. But once again, thank you so much for taking the time today to attend.
And I just want to real quickly say, if anybody has feedback for us around anything, the length or the speakers or what you'd like to see in the future, please do reach out. We are open. We set this to 90 minutes, even though the community team didn't think that our users would stay on that long, but we know how engaged the K-12 community is. So thank you for staying on. And again, we're open to feedback and any future ideas beyond just listening to people speak. We could absolutely have presentations by Tableau as well. So thank you all so much. And thank you to our presenters, of course.
Yes, thank you so much to our presenters.